Section 4 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 4. Civilization, Barbarism, Aggregations of Population, the Press, New Kinds of Crime. Subchapter 26. Civilization and Barbarism. Among the numerous social problems, there is one especially whose certain and complete solution concerns us greatly. It is that of the influence of civilization upon crime and insanity. If we judge by statistics alone, we shall conclude that the problem is already solved, for in every country of Europe except England, we find that crime and insanity are each year increasing out of proportion to the growth of the population. A footnote is displayed on the page. In France from 1826 to 1837, there was one person indicted to each 100 of the population. In 1868, the indictments had reached 1 to 55. Dufault, Traité de Statistique, 1840, Bloch, L. Europolitique, 1870. From 1825 to 1838, the indictments, excluding political crimes and fiscal misdemeanors, rose from 57,470 to 80,920. In 1838, the indictments increased from 237 to the 100,000 to 375. In 1847 to 480, and from 1854 to 55 to 1866, they sank to 389, to increase again to 517 in 1874 and to 552 in 1889. There was then an increase of about 133% in 50 years. Joly, France Criminal, page 10. Another table is displayed on the page, displaying data for years, the conviction rate, the number of inhabitants and indictments in Austria and England and Wales. From 1805 to 1841, the population increased 49%, the crime 6 times more than the population. In some countries, Monmouthshire for example, the population increased about 128%, crime 720%. Aberdeen Discoro, 1876. In Italy there were, from 1850 to 1859, 16,173 indictments for serious crimes and 7,535 convictions. From 1860 to 1869, 23,854 indictments and 10,701 convictions. From 1863 to 1869, crimes increased 1/10, the population about 1/20. Curcio Opsio. But Messedaglia rightly observes in this connection how easy it is to make a mistake in attempting to solve, on the basis of statistics alone, complex problems into which many factors enter at the same time. The continual increase of crime and insanity can, in fact, be explained by changes in the civil and penal laws, by a greater tendency to bring accusations, by the easy access to asylums for the insane, and by the greater activity of the police. One thing appears certain. Civilization and barbarism alike possess crimes peculiar to them. Barbarism, by deadening the moral sensibilities, diminishes the horror of homicide, which is frequently admired as a heroic act. By making revenge a duty and confusing might with right, it increases crimes of blood and encourages associations of malefactors, just as among the insane develops religious mania, demonomania, and imitative insanity. On the other hand, family ties are stronger, while sexual excitement and insane ambition are less frequent, and consequently, parricide, infanticide, and theft are less frequent. The types of civilization which man is hitherto produced, according to Guglielmo Ferraro, are two: the type characterized by violence and that characterized by fraud. They are distinguished by the form which the struggle for existence takes. In the primitive civilization, the struggle is carried on purely by force, and wealth and power achieved by arms, at the expense either of foreigners or of weaker fellow citizens. Commercial competition between two peoples is carried on through armies and fleets, that is to say, by the violent expulsion of competitors from coveted markets. Judicial contests are decided by the duel. In the civilization characterized by fraud, on the other hand, the struggle for existence is carried on by cunning and deceit, and the wager of battle is replaced by legal chicanery. Political power is obtained no longer at the point of the sword, but by money. Money is extracted from the pockets of others by tricks and mysterious maneuvers, such as the operations of the stock exchange. The commercial warfare is carried on through the perfection of the means of production, but still more through the perfection of the art of deceit. The skill acquired in giving the purchaser the impression that he is getting a good bargain. To the first type there belong Corsica, part of Sardinia, Montenegro, the Italian cities of the Middle Ages, and in general nearly all primitive civilizations. To the second type, on the other hand, belong all the modern civilized nations, that is to say, those among whom the capitalistic regime has reached its complete development. The distinction between the two types is not, however, so absolute in reality as it is in theory, for characteristics belonging to the two different types are often found mixed together in the same society. Now, since pathology, in the social field as in the physical, follows in a pathway of physiology, we discover these same two means of contest in the criminal world. As a matter of fact, there are two forms of criminality manifesting themselves in our day, side by side. Atavistic criminality, which is a return on the part of certain individuals of a morbid constitution to the violent means of the struggle for existence now suppressed by civilization, such as homicide, robbery, and rape, and evolutive criminality, which is no less perverted in intent but more civilized in the means employed. For in place of violence he uses trickery and deceit. In the first class of criminals fall only a few individuals, fatally predisposed to crime. In the second, anyone may come who has not a character strong enough to resist the evil influences of his environment. Segel rightly observes that the same division occurs in the two forms of collective criminality, which are to be found, the one in the upper and the other in the lower ranks of society. On the one side are the rich or well-to-do, who in politics and business sell their votes and influence, and by the aid of intrigue, deceit, and speculation steal money from the public. On the other hand, there are poor and ignorant, who, in anarchist plots and demonstrations and insurrections, attempt to revolt against the situation to which they are forced and the wickedness of those in high places. The first of these two forms is especially modern and evolved. The second is atavistic, brutal, violent. The former is a thing of the brain, and proceeds by a cunning device, like imposture, misappropriation, or forgery. The latter is a thing of the muscles, and works by violent means, like insurrection, bomb-throwing, or assassination. Italy, in the last few years, offered only too frequently the sad spectacle of the simultaneous breaking out of both forms of criminality. On the one hand, we have had in Sicily brigandage and famine riots, to which a pious or interested lie has given another name and ascribed other causes. At the same time, we have seen at Rome, in connection with the bank scandals, the gross immorality of the wealthy classes. I have given in my Homme Criminel examples of crimes of blood committed in the Middle Ages by special associations. But it may be asked, why, even ancient times, these criminal associations existed everywhere, have they persisted in certain countries only disappearing from the others? The answer is easy if we consider the partially civilized condition of the peoples, and especially the condition of the governments which maintain and foster this barbarism, the first and continuous source of these perverted associations. The more governments are organized as parties, says Ezechia very truly, the more will parties organize themselves into governments. When the royal post office violated the privacy of letters, and bargaining with thieves allowed them full liberty for all their excesses in brothels and prisons, the very necessities of the situation contributed to protect the communist, for he was the one person who could carry a letter safely, protect one from assassination, ransom a stolen object at a fair price, or even pronounce, in minor matters, judgments doubtless as just as, and certainly quicker and less costly than those offered by the regular tribunals. The Camorra was a kind of natural adaptation to the unhappy circumstances of a people rendered barbarous by bad government. Brigandage, in its turn, has often been a kind of wild justice against oppressors. In the period of serfdom in Russia, the moujiks, indifferent to life and embittered by constant suffering for which no one cared, were all ready to avenge themselves by homicide, as is proved to us by a song made public by Dixon. There is no great Russian family, says well-known author of the work on European prisons, which does not include in its history the violent death of one of its members. The immobilization of capital and avarice drove the rich men of southern Italy to usury and unbelievable plundering of the poor peasants. In Fondi, writes Giorgis, many became brigands on account of the extortions of the mayor, Amante. Coppa, Messini, and Tortora are driven to brigandage by the way their inhabitants were abused with impunity. The peasants of southern Italy, says Govone, in the investigating committee see in the brigand the avenger of the injustice with which society overwhelms them. The dissensions between rich and poor over the division of certain lands which formerly belonged to ancient barons, but of which the title was now in doubt, which had been promised to all, especially to the poor farmers. The hatred which divided the few representatives of the lesser nobility in the communes of southern Italy, and the acts of vengeance practised against the clients of one or another. These were the principal cases of brigandage. Of 124 communes in Basilicata, there were only 44 without a brigand, and these were the only ones where the administration was in the hands of honest mayors. Of the two communes, Bomba and Montezzoli, near Chieti, the first, where the poor were well treated, had no brigands, while the second, where they were abused, had a great number of brigands. In the smaller states of southern Italy, observes Villari very truly, the Middle Ages still exist in the midst of modern civilization, only in place of the ancient baron we have today the plebeian creditor. We have in Sicily, writes Franchetti, a class of peasants who are almost slaves of the soil, a second class consisting of persons who consider themselves superior to the law, and a third, and this the most numerous, who regard the law as useless and exalted to the dignity of a principle the custom of securing justice for themselves by their own efforts. And where the majesty of the law is misunderstood and despised, its representatives cannot be respected. The public official in Sicily is flattered and fawned upon so long as the originators of the abuses and tyrannies there hope to have him for an accomplice, or at least as a silent spectator of their misdeeds. But as soon as a man is discovered who is faithful to his duty, he is detested, hunted, assailed, and opposed by every possible means. After the abolition of feudalism, continues Fanchetti in another place, the external form of the social relationships had to change. Even the real nature of those relationships did not. The absolute power of the great had ceased to be a legal institution, together with the jurisdiction and police power of the nobility. The instrument which must now be employed to cover up abuses was the officer of the state or city. But bribery did not always suffice to secure his connivance. It was necessary to employ special artifice. Some device must be used to acquire or retain control over those whose economic condition did not directly reduce them to practical slavery. Brute force had to give place, in part, to trickery and cunning. But for all that, violence was not done away with, at least in a large part of the island. Nothing had come to break up the ancient traditions, and the instruments for carrying them into effect had not ceased to exist. The former officers of the feudal barons, though thrust to one side, were still there, to say nothing of the men who had already committed some crime, or were ready to do so, and who could not fail to be numerous in a country where the opportunity for crime and the powerlessness of the law were traditional. But now the officers, like the criminals, plied their trade on their own account, and whoever wanted their aid had to treat with them both. The word malandrino in Sicily loses its significance as a term of infamy, and comes to be used among the people as a laudatory designation, proudly borne by many honourable persons. I am a brigand. Malandrino means for them that the speaker claims to be a brave man, afraid of nothing, especially not afraid of justice, which they confuse with the government, or rather with the police. This false conception of morals, this lack of perception of the distance between honesty and double-dealing, explains how it is that the brigand finds accomplices among the peasants and even among the proprietaires with whom he lives, and who regard crime as a new means of speculation. This state of things, according to the reports of the prefects, is the worst plague in Sicily, for while the real brigands who roam the country are few in number, at certain times they become legion, reinforced by their peasant auxiliaries. Further, the great proprietaries themselves make use of the brigands for the purpose of exacting ransoms and annulling wills and establishing their tyranny over their fellow citizens. From this comes their repugnance to laying information, which seemed to them more immoral than murder itself, so that a dying man may conceal the name of his murderer to the last. It is not homicide that arouses their aversion, but the law. Accordingly, in a few cases in which accusation is brought, the crime still goes generally without punishment. Thus, in the province of Naples, of 150 brigands taken with arms in their hands, 107 were acquitted by the jury, and only 7 convicted. The situation is the same in the Romagna, as Alfred Comandini has shown us, and according to Board and Bornet, in Corsica also. The cause of all our ills, writes Comandini, is the abuse of wine. the widespread custom of carrying arms, and the political associations that have come down as a tradition from the despotic times when all classes took part in them, even at the peril of their lives. Their aspirations were honourable, but very often they favoured the escape of a prisoner, because if arrested, he might betray them. These associations have no longer any political or educative aim, not even that of mutual assistance. They afford oftenest only an occasion for drinking together, generally at the expense of the richer members, and this usually degenerates into fighting and brawling, in which from their traditional duty of aiding one another large numbers are frequently involved. But even more significant than the situation in the Romagna is the example which Corsica gives of an unconscious criminality, derived from social historical conditions, as well as from the purely historical influences already pointed out. The frequency of murders committed out of revenge, writes Bonnet, is known to all the world, but it is not so well known how trivial the causes often are. That a dog belonging to a Tafani was killed by a Rossino caused the death of 11 members of the two families. In 1886 there were 135 attacks upon persons, or 1 to 200 inhabitants. This is to say, 4 times more than the department of the scene. Of these 135 attacks, 52 were made a result of quarrels and brawls. No witness can be made to testify. In Palermo there were 60 persons present at a crime, all of whom swore that they had seen nothing. Board, the following reports of the constabulary estimates the number of banners at from 500 to 600. It all comes back to this, he says, that the peasants in remote villages who are enemies to the chief of the clan are persuaded that there is no justice. The Corsicans are very proud, scorn physical labour, and till the soil only unwillingly. They are better endowed intellectually than morally, and have a way of their own of regarding good fortune and conduct. Their organization is very similar to the Roman patrician system. 15 or 20 families rule all the rest, some having control of only 100 votes, others having thousands of electors to express their will. For 200 years, 50 families have been devoted to a single one. Independent life is impossible, for he who stands alone comes to nothing. The members of a family risk their lives with sublime self-abnegation for the sake of one of their number. 2 consciences struggle for supremacy on the island. The modern conscience, inspired by the principles of right and equity, and the ancient Corsican conscience, which cannot rise itself above the interests of the family association. The latter generally prevails, and the effects of it were seen in the proceedings of the jury which valued the land condemned for the railways. The jury presided over by Casabianca, the chief of the most powerful party in the island, made itself notorious by its partiality. Benedetti, an enemy of the party, received 2,000 francs for a vineyard of 17 acres, while a certain Vigiti, a follower of Casabianca's, received 13,000 francs for a vineyard of 19 acres, and so on. In Corsica, even the victims thought these injustices natural, and would have practiced them themselves if they had had the power. The justices of the peace are all-powerful, but very partial and devoted to the interest of the party that has elected them. In making up the voting list, they do so as they like, striking off the names of those who might injure them, and adding the names of those who may be useful, and this in spite of the courts of appeals and cassation. Serious crimes not infrequently result. The artificers employed at elections are numerous and varied, and often have a tragic ending. At Palneca, the mayor, Bartoli, 3 times postponed the voting, waiting for a favourable moment. The 4th time, September 28, 1884, he and his partisans fortified themselves early in the morning in the town hall, and when their adversaries arrived they could not enter. These, exasperated, attempted to storm the place, but were repulsed with firearms. All day shots were exchanged from one house to the other, with deaths and wounds resulting. Bartoli's opponents told the prefect that they would rather die than endure such slavery. In 1885, in all France, there were 42,523 misdemeanors in rural districts. Corsica alone had 13,405 of them, nearly a third. The progress of civilization, by endlessly multiplying needs and desires, and by encouraging sensuality through the accumulation of wealth, brings a flood of alcoholics and general paralytics into the insane asylums. The crowds of prisons, which offenders against property and against decency. Statistics show us, in fact, that most crimes of this character committed in the great cities among the cultivated classes are on the increase. Ezechia shows us for his part that modern collective criminality has the same characteristics. A table is displayed on the page, displaying statistical data relating to crimes in Prussia and compared to France. There's a summary at the bottom, where the ratio of burglaries and highway robberies in Corsica to those in France was 0.38 to 1, of rapes 0.5 to 1, of parricides and bankruptcies 0 to 1, of extortions 3.0 to 1, rapes of young girls 23 to 1, homicides 32 to 1. Confronted by those two forms of collective criminality, it is natural to ask ourselves, why does the criminality of the rich take the form of cunning, while that of the poor is based upon violence? The answer is easy. The upper classes represent what is really modern, while the lower still belong in thought and feeling to a relatively distant past. It is then logical and natural that the former should show the result of modern development in their collective criminality, and that the latter should remain, on the contrary, still violent, not to say absolutely atavistic. Bacot has said, in order to be persuaded that fineness of feeling diminishes in proportion as one descends the social scale, it is not necessary to visit savage peoples. It is enough to talk with the English poor, or even one's own servants. In the second place, if the criminality of the rich is a pathological phenomenon indicative of the defectiveness of the ancient social organization that has come down to us, that of the lower class, on the contrary, may appear to be the premature announcement of a new era about to arise. It is for this reason that the former bears all the marks of senile cunning, while the latter has the reckless audacity of youthful strength. Finally, the rich constitute the majority, if not in number, at least in power and in the strength of their position. The poor, on the other hand, represent the minority. Now, it is characteristic of all minorities to be bolder and more violent than the majority. They have to conquer, while the majority only have to keep what they have gained. More energy is called out by the chance to attain something, or reach a little goal, than by the need of guarding a present possession. Victory softens and innervates, while the desire to conquer increases the courage 100-fold. It is in fact with a minority as it is with a single individual who is attacked by a number of persons. Such a one shows a degree of strength which he would not at all manifest if odds were not at hand to aid him. Necessity increases the defensive power of those who stand alone and feel their weakness. The instinct of self-preservation, aroused by danger, gives to the organism the courage of despair. In the field of crime, this natural law cannot fail to show itself among the lower classes, who have to contend against great odds and make up for their natural weakness by the boldness and violence of the means they employ. However painful it may be to admit that civilization has succeeded only in changing the kind of crimes, and perhaps increasing their number, the fact itself is easy to understand, when one sees how much more advantageous the progress of education has been for attack than for defense. Subchapter 27. Congestion of population. To the reasons which we have just enumerated must be added others of a different order. On account of railways and government and commercial concentration, civilization tends continually to mark the great centers of population still larger and to overpopulate the principal cities, and, as is well known, it is in these that are found crowded together the greatest number of habitual criminals. This unfortunate concentration of crime is to be explained by the greater profits or the greater security which the largest cities offer to criminals. By this, perhaps, is not the only reason, for even the city's vigilance is more relaxed, prosecution is more active and systematic, and temptations and inducements to crime are more numerous, so are the opportunities for honest labour. I believe that there is another influence of work which is more powerful still. The very congestion of population by itself gives an irresistible impulse toward crime and immorality. There is, writes Bertillon, a kind of violent and morbid tendency that moves us to reproduce the feelings and movements which we see around us. Many causes contribute to this: youth, femininity, and above all, as Sartre says, the mutual contact of sensitive persons, which gives added strength to the natural impressions that each one has by himself. The air is filled with a dominant opinion, and transmits it like a contagion. It has been observed that even the crowd together of horses develops a tendency to sodomy. All these causes, together with the parallelism that always exists between the development of the sexual organs and of the brain, and also with better nutrition, partly explains for us the great increase of crimes of sensuality, a characteristic of modern criminality harmonizing with a constant increase of prostitution so marked in the large cities. It is for this reason that women are more criminal in the more civilized countries. They are almost always drawn to crime by a false pride about their poverty, by desire for luxury, and by masculine occupations and education, which give them the means and opportunity to commit crimes of the same character as the men, such as forgeries, crimes against the laws of the press, and swindling. Civilization increases the number of certain crimes, just as it increases certain forms of insanity. Paralysis alcoholism, because it increases the use of stimulants, which, while almost unknown to savages, have become a veritable necessity to the civilized world. Thus we see today in England and America that in addition to the abuse of alcohol and tobacco, there is creeping in that of opium and even of ether, and that in France the consumption of brandy grew from 8 litres in 1840 to 30 in 1870. Subchapter 28. The Press. Civilization, by favouring the creation and dissemination of newspapers, which are always a chronicle of vices and crimes, and often are nothing else, has furnished a new cause of crime by inducing criminals to emulation and imitation. It is sad to think that the crimes of Trotman brought the circulation of the Petit Journal up to 500,000, and that the Figaro to 210,000. It was doubtless for this reason that the crime was imitated almost immediately in Belgium and Italy. Note the following strange crime. During the absence of the proprietor R, his strong box was forced. His assistant was immediately arrested, and the exact sum taken was found upon him. Indeed, the assistant admitted of his own accord that he had taken the money, but without evil intent. He had, in fact, without necessity of breaking into the safe, much larger sums under his control, and this with the consent of his employer, who had great confidence in him. He had committed the crime, he said, only in order to try a trick that he had read a day before in the newspaper. His employer, knowing him to be a constant reader of the papers, declared that he accepted his explanation, and as soon as the assistant had been acquitted, reinstated him in his position. In Paris in 1873, one Grammel decided to commit a crime in order to get himself talked of, like certain great criminals, of whose exploits he read in the newspapers. With this aim he committed arson, but notwithstanding his confession, his guilt was not believed. He maltreated his wife with the result that she died, avowing himself the cause of her death, but he came out of this affair also with the verdict of not guilty. Then it was that the case of the widow Grass fell under his eye, and in order to imitate it, he threw nitric acid into a friend's face, thereby killing him, and then went about telling everyone of his crime. Next day he first hastened to read the account of the murder in the Petit Journal, and immediately afterwards went to give himself up as a prisoner. It was perfectly obvious that reading criminal tales and various other reports in the papers suggested to him the idea of his crimes. The same may be said of those novels which deal almost exclusively with the acts of criminals, like those at present fashionable in France. Thus in 1866 2 young men, Brullier and Serrault, strangled a tradeswoman. When arrested, they declared that the crime had been suggested to them by reading a novel by Delmons. Some, says Laplace very truly, have received from nature an organism inclined to evil, but their inclination is turned into action only by hearing or seeing the misdeeds of others. Some years ago a package of 10 stolen bonds was found done up in a paper, upon which the thief had written those gloomy lines taken from a novel by Barrasque, conscious the word invented to frighten fools and to make them submissive in their misery. Thrones and millions are only to be gained by violence and fraud. In the great cities, many are incited to crime in the places where cheap lodgings may be obtained for the night. Many, says Mayhew, are brought to the lodging-house through being thrown out of work, and from the lodging-house are drawn to theft. The political laws and the new forms of popular government imposed by modern civilization, and in part also by our pretended liberty, favour in every way the formation of societies and the pretext of social amusements, administrative enterprises, or mutual aid. The example of Palermo, Leghorn, Ravenna, Bologna, the history of Luciani and Page, and that of Crispi and Nicotera, show us how short the distance is from such generous enterprises to the most immoral violence and even to crime. In North America, some societies have gone so far as to commit crime with impunity, and in two of the most flourishing cities, New York and San Francisco, even officially they have almost succeeded in legitimizing their frauds. The political revolutions which are more frequent with these forms of government cause an increase of certain crimes, either because they bring together crowds of people or because they excite violent passions. Spain is a prison, says an illustrious Spaniard, where it is possible to commit any crime, whatever with impunity, provided one cries in favour of this or that, or gives to his crime a political appearance. The number of criminals acquitted there rose in 5 years to 4,065, 4 times what they were in France. It is not astonishing, then, that in Spain crimes are proportionally more numerous than elsewhere. Wars, like revolutions, increase the number of crimes because of the increased massing and contact of men, as was proved in Italy in 1866, Curcio, and in North America during and after the Civil War. Sexual crimes, which before the Revolution of 1848 in France were from 100 to 200, increased first to 280 and then to 505, and with them illegitimate births increased also. After all this, it is easy to comprehend, without the necessity of citing figures, how much crimes increased when the criminals are herded together in prisons, where, according to the avowal of the criminals themselves, the greatest wickedness is a title to glory, and virtue is a badge of shame. Civilization, by multiplying great penitentiaries, gives, by that same means, a greater extension to crime. This is the more true, since unblameable solicitude has introduced charitable and philanthropic institutions, reform schools, etc., which suffice to undermine the character of respectable individuals, but not to soften the heart of a hardened culprit. We shall see how, after the introduction of the ticket of leave, there was noted in 1861-62 in England a great increase of delinquents, who had already occurred in 1843 after the inauguration of the transportation system. The houses of correction, which seem inspired by a truly humanitarian feeling of charity, through the single fact of their bringing together the mass of depraved individuals, exercise an influence quite other than salutary, and always directly opposite to that for which they were instituted. It is worth noting here that the illustrious Oliver Crona attributed the greatest number of Swedish recidivists to the vices of the penitentiary system, and to the custom of submitting young offenders to the same discipline as the adults. Subchapter 29. New Crimes. Civilization introduces every day new crimes, less atrocious perhaps than the old ones, but none the less injurious. Thus in London the thief substitutes cunning for violence. In place of burglary he practices purloining by means of special apparatus. In place of porch climbing he uses swindling and blackmail by the aid of the press. Homicide with the aim of getting the benefit of life insurance is an example of a new form of crime committed by some physicians, and favoured too often by new advances in scientific knowledge. Thus the knowledge that the symptoms of arsenic poisoning are similar to those of cholera suggests to 2 doctors during the cholera epidemic in Magdeburg and Monaco the idea of first insuring and then poisoning many of their patients. In Vienna a new crime has been invented, which consists of appropriating goods that have been ordered for an imaginary society. The anarchists have brought into fashion the use of dynamite against persons and buildings. Recently there have been introduced in Chicago the electric bludgeon, and also a small torpedo, which being slipped into the intended victim's pocket explodes and blows him to pieces. Civilization, by relaxing the bonds of the family, not only increases the number of foundling asylums, which are the nurseries of criminals, but also multiplies the desertions of adults, rapes, and infanticides. Notwithstanding these unhappy consequences, we must not allow ourselves to be led into an indiscriminate condemnation on the fruitful progress of civilization, since even in the matter of crime the change has not been altogether prejudicial, for if for the time civilization has been the cause of the increase of crime, it has certainly mitigated its character. On the other hand, where progress has reached its height, it has already found means of treating the diseases it has produced, with its asylums for the criminal insane, its system of separate confinement in the penitentiaries, its industrial institutions, its saving banks, and especially its societies for the protection of children, which prevent crime almost from the cradle. See Part 3. End of Section 4.